Darnell Cross was 38 years old when his wife slapped him across the face in the lobby of the Meridian Tower in Charlotte, North Carolina, in front of 11 people who worked for her. Two attorneys she was paying $400 an hour each, and one senior acquisitions partner from a private equity firm that had flown in from New York to close a $900 million commercial real estate deal. He had driven himself to that lobby in a 7-year-old Nissan Altima with a cracked rear bumper. He wore a gray blazer he'd had since his brother's wedding. Her colleagues called him Darlene's husband, usually without the name, and she had stopped correcting them sometime around the third year of their marriage. She struck him because he had walked into the room without being invited. That was how she explained it afterward, to her business partner, loud enough that her assistant heard. He had walked into the room without being invited, as if a man could wander into his own wife's milestone moment and simply stand there like a piece of furniture she hadn't ordered. What Simone did not know, what none of the attorneys in that glass conference room on the 41st floor knew, was that the land beneath the 4 commercial parcels at the center of the deal was not owned by her development company. It had never been owned by her development company. It was held in a land trust. The trust had one beneficiary. That beneficiary had been standing in the lobby of Meridian Tower with a handprint on his face when the call came down from the 41st floor asking very urgently where the spousal consent form was. Darnell had not signed it. He had not been asked to sign it. Now, without his signature, the closing could not proceed. $900 million. On pause. Because of the man she just slapped, before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you're watching from, and subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The coffee was still hot when Darnell set it on the workbench that occupied the back quarter of their garage in the Coolwood neighborhood of Charlotte, just past the city line where the houses had yards and the streets still had trees. He came out here most mornings before work, not to build anything in particular, just to keep his hands moving. His grandfather had been a finish carpenter, and there was something in the smell of sawdust and machine oil that organized his thinking in ways that nothing else quite did. His grandfather used to say, "You can't fix what you won't measure." He said it about wood. He said it about everything else, too. Darnell was a contracts attorney at a mid-sized firm in uptown Charlotte, the kind of firm that did solid, transactional work without the name recognition that Simone's world ran on. He had spent 12 years reviewing agreements, drafting easements, untangling title complications, and doing the slow, unglamorous work of making sure that what people thought they owned was actually what they owned. He drove a used Altima, brought his lunch 4 days out of 5, and wore his wedding ring on the hand that signed documents no one else wanted to read. Simone ran Caldwell Development Group, a commercial real estate firm she had founded 8 years ago with seed capital from her father and a relentlessness that Darnell had admired before he understood all of what it required. She had an eye for distressed commercial corridors and a gift for assembling investors. Her company had gone from 2 employees to 41. Her name appeared in the Charlotte Business Journal with a frequency that pleased her and that she tracked carefully. They had met at a real estate law conference in Atlanta 12 years ago. She was presenting a case study on adaptive reuse. He was in the audience. She had used the phrase clean title incorrectly in her presentation. And afterward, when the room was clearing, he had approached her and said so very politely, and she had laughed in a way that he'd felt in his sternum. They had talked for 3 hours over coffee that turned cold. She had asked him to check her contracts. He had done it for free for 6 months before they were together. And then she'd said he was too good to be her attorney and too important to let go, and she kissed him in the parking garage of the hotel where the conference was held. He had believed for a long time that she meant that. Now, Simone rarely ate dinner at home. Her phone lived face down on the counter or face down in her palm, never resting, always managing something. When she spoke to him, it was functional. Confirmation of schedules, logistics, the domestic operations of a household she had largely delegated to his management. She was not cruel. She was simply elsewhere, and had been for long enough that Darnell had stopped expecting otherwise. His other portfolio, the one she didn't know about, the one his contracts firm handled separately under a numbered trust agreement, had been growing quietly for 9 years. It was not something he advertised. He had structured it the way he structured everything, correctly, carefully, with proper documentation and a very clean title. The morning he drove to Meridian Tower, Simone had already left the house before 6. She texted him the night before to say the closing was today and that it would run long and that there was dinner in the refrigerator if he got home before her. She had not told him the address. He knew it anyway because he had been involved in the original assembly of those 4 parcels in ways she had never thought to ask about. He had driven downtown, parked in the public garage, and gone up to the lobby to wish her well. That was all. He had wanted to see her face when she walked into the most important day of her professional life. Instead, he had seen the back of her hand. He stood in that lobby afterward with his jaw set and his cheeks stinging, and 11 people looking at the floor, and he thought about his grandfather's workbench, and he thought about measuring before you cut, and he thought, she has never once asked whose name is on the ground she's been building on. He walked back to his car, he drove to his office, he called his attorney. His attorney was a man named Gerald Osee, who had been Darnell's law school classmate, and who had this specific, relaxed precision of someone who had seen a great many situations and had learned to calibrate his alarm accordingly. When Darnell told him what had happened, Gerald was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Did you know about the spousal consent requirement? Gerald asked. I knew when the deal was filed, Darnell said. I was not informed about the closing date until this morning when her assistant called my cell phone from the 41st floor. Another brief silence. Were you served with any spousal consent request prior to today? No. Were you provided any documentation outlining the deal terms or your role as a married party holding a beneficial interest in the underlying trust? No. So she proceeded to a $900 million closing involving property held in a trust where you are the named beneficiary, without notifying you, without serving a consent form, and without your knowledge. Yes, Darnell said, and she slapped me when I showed up. Gerald exhaled slowly. All right, he said. Don't sign anything. Don't respond to any calls from her attorneys. Give me 2 hours. Darnell sat at his office desk and opened the trust documents on his computer. He had reviewed them 6 months ago as a routine matter, the way he reviewed all his holdings periodically. The 4 parcels, 2 on West Trade Street, 1 near the South End corridor, 1 in the No Dad neighborhood, had been assembled between 7 and 11 years ago, purchased in a distressed market through a land trust he had structured with Gerald's help and funded with the proceeds of a small inheritance from his grandfather and a decade of careful reinvestment. He had never told Simone, not because he was hiding it, because she had never asked. He pulled the parcel records. The trust name on each deed was Meridian Land Holdings Trust. Gerald was the trustee of record. Darnell was the sole beneficiary. The deal Simone's company was closing today was the sale of the development rights and the underlying fee interest in those same 4 parcels to a New York-based private equity firm. The total consideration, $912 million. Simone's company stood to receive a development fee and carried interest. The actual land, the ground, belonged to the trust that belonged to Darnell. His face remained perfectly calm. He opened a new file on his computer. He labeled it Caldwell Closing. He began to document. He pulled the original acquisition records for each parcel, the HUD, 1 settlement statements, the warranty deeds, the trust transfer agreements. He pulled the recording confirmations from the Mecklenburg County Register of Deeds. He cross-referenced the parcel identification numbers against the deal documentation that had been filed in the public record as part of the equity firm's due diligence. The parcel numbers matched perfectly. What he found next was the part that required him to sit still for a moment. Buried in the deal structure was a subordination agreement, a document that Simone's company had filed with Mecklenburg County 8 months ago, representing that the fee interest in the 4 parcels was unencumbered and fully within the control of Caldwell Development Group. That representation was incorrect. The trust interest had never been subordinated. No one had asked Darnell. No one had disclosed the trust to the equity firm. He read the subordination agreement twice. He moved with the same careful patience he brought to every document that needed to be read correctly. He made 4 phone calls. The first was to Gerald. Pull the subordination agreement they filed in February, he said. Third paragraph, tell me what you see. Gerald was quiet for a long moment. That's a material misrepresentation to the acquiring party, he said. That's not just a closing problem, Darnell. That's potential fraud. I know. Do you want to call the equity firm's counsel directly, or do you want to let her attorneys figure out what they're holding first? Darnell looked out his office window at the Charlotte skyline. The Meridian Tower caught the afternoon light at its upper floors. Let them figure it out, he said. I'll be available by phone. The second call was to his uncle Raymond, who had introduced him to his grandfather's carpentry, who had watched him grow up, and who had met Simone exactly 4 times, and had each time managed to say something kind and specific about her that Darnell recognized as the careful diplomacy of a man with an opinion he was waiting to be asked for. It happened today, Darnell said. I wondered when, Raymond said. You sound steady. I am steady. What do you need from me? Nothing yet. I wanted someone who knew the whole shape of it to know it had started. Raymond was quiet for a moment. Your grandfather used to say the only thing you owe a structure that's failing is an honest assessment. He paused. You've done the assessment. Yes. Darnell said, then you know what to do. The third call was to a forensic accountant named Brenda Atchaby, whom Gerald had used on 2 previous matters, and who had the demeanor of someone who found other people's financial irregularities mildly interesting in the way that a chess player finds an opponent's mistake mildly interesting, not with satisfaction, just with the automatic recognition of what it meant. Darnell asked her to pull Caldwell Development Group's financial filings for the past 4 years and cross-reference them against the parcel records. She called him back in 3 hours. The results were specific. Simone's company had been using the 4 parcels as collateral in its operating lines of credit since the 3rd year of their marriage, a period during which Darnell had been listed on her company's internal org chart as legal advisor and had occasionally reviewed contracts she brought him, without ever being shown the credit agreements. The parcels had been pledged as collateral on $24 million in outstanding debt. The lenders had been given representations of clear ownership that were, Brenda said in her even accountant's way, inconsistent with the recorded trust interest. The fourth call was brief. It was to the closing coordinator at Meridian Tower. He said he was available to discuss the signature matter at his office or by phone, at their convenience. He left his direct number. He did not call Simone. He drove home. He changed out of his blazer. He went to the garage and spent 90 minutes at the workbench fitting a set of cabinet door frames he'd been working on since October. He measured each piece twice. He cut once. That evening, Simone came home at 9:30. She stood in the kitchen doorway with her coat still on and her eyes carrying the look of someone who had spent the last 6 hours in rooms where people were saying things she didn't want to hear. He was at the kitchen table with a glass of water and a book. She said his name. He looked up. The closing couldn't proceed, she said. I heard, he said. She waited for him to say more. He looked at her with the calm, patient attention he brought to documents that required him to understand every word before he responded to any of them. I need to talk to you, she said. I know, he said. I think it should be with our attorneys present. She stared at him. In 11 years, he had never once suggested they speak through attorneys. He watched her process it, the way a sentence in a contract could look simple on the surface, and then, on second reading, reveal that it changed everything that came after it. She had no idea what he had been measuring all this time and what it added up to. The 2 days between that conversation and the Thursday meeting were quiet ones. Darnell went to work. He reviewed contracts. He ate lunch at the sandwich counter 3 blocks from his office, where the man behind the counter knew his order and handed it over without being asked. He came home and went to the garage and worked on the cabinet frames and let the smell of sawdust do what it had always done. Simone moved through the house with the contained electric tension of a woman waiting for a deposition. She answered her phone in low tones in the bedroom. She reviewed documents at the kitchen table until past midnight, a glass of red wine at her elbow, her eyes moving over pages with the focus of someone looking for a way out of a structure they had built themselves. He brought her a glass of water once, set it beside her without comment, and she looked up at him with something he couldn't fully name. Not gratitude, not guilt, something in between. Something that was still doing its math. He made his lunch for the next day. He turned off the kitchen light. He said goodnight. She did not say it back, and he did not require her to. Preparation was not a single moment. It was the accumulation of all the moments in which you did the next correct thing. The meeting happened on a Thursday morning in Gerald's conference room, a quiet space on the 14th floor of a building on South Tryon Street, with a view of Romare Bairden Park and the kind of institutional calm that belonged to rooms where serious things were settled without theater. Simone arrived with her attorney, a sharp woman named Diane Presley, who had done the Caldwell development work for 4 years, and who, Darnell could see from the careful neutrality of her expression, had spent the past 48 hours learning things about her client's portfolio that she had not previously known. Gerald opened by introducing the trust documentation, the original deed records, the trust agreement dated 11 years ago, predating the marriage, the beneficiary designation, the complete chain of title. Diane Presley reviewed the documents with the focused composure of an attorney absorbing a surprise she would not allow herself to visibly react to. Simone looked at the pages, then she looked at Darnell. "You owned the land," she said. "It was not quite a question. The trust has held fee simple title to all 4 parcels since their original acquisition," Gerald said. "The trust predates your marriage by 14 months. The beneficial interest belongs entirely to Mr. Cross." Simone's jaw tightened. "You never told me. You never asked," Darnell said quietly. "You also never told me you were pledging those parcels as collateral on $24 million in operating credit, or that you filed a subordination agreement representing clear fee ownership, or that you were closing a $900 million deal in which the ground under every building involved belongs to a trust I control." He did not raise his voice. There was no reason to raise it. The documents on the table said everything that needed to be said. Brenda Atcheby's report went down next. The credit agreements, the lender representations, the dates, the amounts. Diane Presley read them, set them down, and said nothing for a long moment. "I want to be clear," Darnell said, "about what I'm asking for and what I'm not. I'm not asking to collapse the deal. The equity firm has done nothing wrong. The closing can proceed. What it requires is an accurate representation of the ownership structure, my signature on the spousal consent and the trust transfer documents, and a corrected accounting between Caldwell Development and Meridian Land Holdings Trust for the use of trust-owned property as collateral over the past 6 years." Diane Presley looked at him carefully. "And what does that accounting look like?" Gerald slid another page across the table. It was Brenda Atcheby's figure, the fair market rental value of the 4 parcels over the 6 years they had been used as collateral, based on comparable Charlotte commercial land rates. Simone looked at the number. Something moved behind her eyes, the slow, visible arithmetic of a woman recalculating the terrain she thought she'd been standing on. "That's not a number I can absorb without restructuring," she said. "I know," Darnell said. "That's what I do. I help people restructure agreements so they reflect what's actually true." He held her gaze. "You should have let me help you from the beginning." Simone's last move was quieter than he expected. Not a fight, not a performance, but a request. Leveled at him directly, her voice stripped of the boardroom register she usually kept in front of colleagues. She asked if there was a version of this in which they stayed married. He had thought about that question more carefully than she knew. "No," he said. He said it without anger and without satisfaction and without hesitation. "But I want you to understand something before we're finished. I was never your obstacle. I was never the thing standing between you and what you were trying to build. I was the man reading contracts in your corner for free for years while you were building something on ground I owned without knowing it." He paused. "You slapped me in a lobby in front of 11 people because I showed up. That's not a marriage I have any interest in saving." Diane Presley looked at her hands. Gerald looked at the park below. Simone looked at Darnell for a long moment, and he watched the understanding arrive on her face the way it arrived when you handed someone a document they had to sign. The moment when the words on the page became real and the weight of them settled. He gathered his copies. He nodded to Gerald. He did not look back at the table as he left. Preparation was the work. The work was done. 9 months later, the four parcels on West Trade Street in South End and in No Duh were part of a completed development deal that had closed on schedule. 6 weeks after the corrected documentation was filed and the trust to buyer transfer executed cleanly, the way all clean transfers executed when the paperwork was right, the equity firm had expressed no objection to the corrected structure. Their counsel had said privately that they appreciated the transparency, which was the professional way of saying that they had noticed the misrepresentation and were relieved it had been resolved before rather than after. Darnell had signed everything that needed his signature. He had not delayed a single document. The divorce was finalized in April. The settlement reflected what was accurate. The trust assets were his, premarital, and clearly documented. The marital home in Coolwood was sold and divided. Simone's company remained operational, stripped of the credit lines that had been collateralized on trust property and restructured on more honest terms. Diane Presley had filed the corrected lender representations. The process had been costly for Caldwell Development Group. Two investors had withdrawn, citing the disclosure irregularities, but the company survived. Darnell had not worked to destroy it. He had simply required it to be correctly described. He heard, through Gerald, that Simone had brought on a new legal advisor and had gone back to the kind of smaller, cleaner deals she had been best at in her first years. He registered this without comment. There was a woman named Alicia Mbai who taught contract law at UNC Charlotte and who had been in the row behind him at a continuing legal education seminar in March. She had leaned forward during the section on land trust structures and asked the presenter a question so precisely calibrated that Darnell had turned around. They had talked for an hour in the parking garage afterward. She asked good questions and did not perform certainty she didn't have and laughed at the right things. She was not impressed by the trust assets, which he'd mentioned only in the context of discussing the case, and she seemed actively more interested in the carpentry. He found that extremely telling. They had eaten dinner twice since March. He was not in a hurry. She did not appear to be either. Some things were better built slowly. On a Saturday morning in October, Darnell stood at the workbench in the garage, the same workbench in a smaller house he was renting while the Coolwood property sold, and fitted the last frame of the cabinet set he had started 2 years ago. He held it against the wall. He checked it with the level. It was true. He stepped back and looked at the whole set from across the garage, the way his grandfather had taught him, not up close where you could miss the shape of things, but from a distance where the whole structure was visible at once. The cabinets were good work. They were his. No one had built them but him, and no one could take them back. His grandfather had built furniture that people still owned, still used 40 years later, because he had understood something that took Darnell, the better part of his 30s, to fully carry. The time you put into getting the joints right was the only investment that could not be taken back. You could lose money, you could lose a house, you could lose a marriage that had been a beautiful thing before it became a transaction, but a joint that was true forever. The wood didn't care about the rest of it. Darnell set the frame down. He looked at it for a moment. He was clear, he was solvent, he was free. The only things worth building, he thought, were the things you were willing to build correctly. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out two more for you that I think you'll really like.